Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening for the CNVS annual meeting. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sean Minahan, the CNVS board chair. I want to just drop in a friendly reminder for all of you to please stay muted for the sort of formal part of the program so we can avoid the dreaded video call background noise. We're going to start with just a few brief business items and then hear from our guest speaker, Ed Aguilar, who we're very excited to hear from. Before starting into our program, I wanted to acknowledge the world in which we gather this evening. It's a world that seems somehow even more dangerous these past few weeks, a world that is sliding backwards towards bloody territorial conquest and nuclear brinkmanship, follies that we might have hoped to leave in the last century. Of course, our hearts go out to those in Ukraine living in neighborhoods that have become war zones, and the millions displaced, hungry, grieving. At this moment, there are civilians sleeping in ruins in Mariupol, children under siege in Kyiv, and a whole world waiting nervously to see how this conflict will escalate. We see the photographs of death and devastation, and it's easy to feel helpless. Moreover, it's easy to conclude that there couldn't possibly be any solutions, let alone nonviolent ones. But as for that helplessness, it doesn't have to have the last word. I take solace in the idea expressed so elegantly by Confucius that peace in the world is a consequence of the peace that starts in our hearts and spreads through our homes and communities. Dr. King reminds us that peace is not just the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. Taken together, these teachers are telling us that whenever we work for a more just world, no matter how small the scale, we begin to realize the dream of a beloved community and a peaceful planet. Peace building is no less meaningful when it happens at the kitchen table or around the corner than when it occurs on the global stage. As for the nonviolent solutions, Mr. Aguilar will have much to say about the path forward out of this war and into the presence of justice. I'm going to hand this over to Claire Schaefer-Duffy for an update on our programs. But first, I'd just like to acknowledge the members of our board who are here tonight, Gina Kuruvilla, Ken Mandiel, and Matt Shorten, whom we'd like to formally welcome to the board. This is his first annual meeting with us as a board member, so thank you, Matt, for being part of our team. And of course, I want to give a nod to Marge Ropp, our most tireless volunteer, who's done so much great work with us over the years. Claire?
Thank you, Sean, for that beautiful reflection. Before we go into a little bit of program overview and giving you the financial report, which is our obligation to you to do at least once a year, I want to take a moment to recognize the lives of two peacemakers who have passed away in the last month. A week ago, Clarence Burley, a longtime member of the Worcester Society of Friends, died in his 90s. He was just a remarkable man, a faithful supporter of the center, also of the Catholic Worker where I am. He embodied the key virtue of a peace builder, which is persistence. Clarence was at it for decades, joining us in vigil after vigil, representing the Friends on so many issues, from nuclear disarmament to human rights to opposition to war in Iraq. He was just a wonderful fellow traveler, and we will miss him dearly. There'll be more about him. I also want to recognize the life of Dr. Paula Green. Those of you who were with us a year ago, she was our featured speaker along with Gwen Johnson. They presented on the dialogue project that they had done in Kentucky. Dr. Green was an extraordinary peace builder of international work. She had worked on dialogue projects in the Middle East and in African states, and was bringing her work back to the US during the Trump administration to help Americans address the polarization that is so afflicting our country. And I only learned from reading her terrific obituary in today's Boston Globe that she was actually living with terminal lung cancer when she presented for us last year. So we salute them and both, and want to recognize the lineage that they have provided for us. So again, welcome to our annual meeting. Here you're seeing us in the flesh tonight, but also in our finer form in photo. And we're especially happy to welcome Matt Shorten, who joined us this year. So glad to have him. The center is a small nonprofit. For those of you joining us the first time, that it was recognized as a nonprofit back in 2010. Our vision is communities where conflicts are resolved nonviolently and where the skills for building a culture of peace are widely known and used to foster greater understanding, harmony, and justice. We seek to build a culture of peace through 4 areas of concentration: youth peace education, public presentations on active nonviolence, and through upholding nonviolent histories. In the past year, we've been specific about those endeavors. We have hosted virtual programs in the spring and fall that feature different presenters, taught at a small alternative school in Shrewsbury known as Gateways Academy. We've worked with college interns on various peace building projects, continued our partnership with state, national, and international peace groups, and premiered a walking tour of Worcester's peace history. One of the dilemmas for peace building, or I should say challenges, is application. The popular perception of peace is that it's a good feeling, nice idea, but how does it work? So in these seasonal series that we do in the spring and fall, we are trying to give example of nonviolence applied. This year we showed Michael Nagler's excellent documentary on the third harmony. We had speakers talk about nonviolent policing. Is that possible? How would it apply in that area? We had presentations on Kingian nonviolence in a public school system. We also celebrated the memoir of our beloved Michael True, a peacemaker of Worcester roots, and looked at gun violence, Massachusetts laws that are trying to address the threat, the public health threat that guns support or present in our society. We also screened the documentary documenting the origin of the United Nations Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which you'll hear more about tonight. We really are continually talking about that story because it's a remarkable history. We taught at Gateways Academy a 10-week course on peace building. We just had 2 students in 2021, but they have asked us to come back. The school is expanding, and this is a sneak photo of kids that have the great fortune of being taught by Mr. Matt Shorten and Ms. Gina Coravilla this year. So they're making great strides on their peace building course. And we also worked with college interns from Holy Cross and Clark University and Worcester State. 3, Luke, Terrence, and Sam, did a documentary series on young peace builders, interviewing international youth peace builders that we screened last May. And Lily Buffalino, also at Clark University, we paid for her to attend a 40-hour training in Kingian nonviolence, which she then applied to an after-school program here in the city, teaching children of African immigrants. During COVID, we had the blessing of Zoom, which really allowed for a lot of connecting with various organizations at the national and international level. So some of our partners that we established 2 years ago, we've deepened those relationships, specifically with Mass Peace Action, Nuclear Ban US, and Moms Demand Action. And just a word, so Nuclear Ban US, as the title implies, they're working very much on the threat of the big guns, you might say, nuclear weapons. And Moms Demand Action are addressing the crisis that we face, especially in America, with the plethora of guns in our community. In June of this year, partnering with Nuclear Ban US, our state rep, Mary Keefe, signed the legislators' pledge to support the UN treaty. So this was a great day of rejoicing that she publicly signed the pledge. It's called the ICANN State Pledge, State Legislators Pledge, in Worcester's very own Peace Park, which Representative Keefe helped to create with mothers whose children had suffered from inner city violence, especially gun violence. And this fall, actually last fall, we premiered the walking tour of Worcester's peace history, and that proved to be really much more successful than we expected. It was going to just be a kind of one-time gig, as they say, but we had 42 people turn out. So we applied for a grant, and we'll be running this tour again this spring and this fall. So look for more information on that. We sure had a lot of fun learning about all the peacemakers and nonviolent people power actions that have happened in our own city. And I will turn it over to Rochelle to give a quick overview on the finances.
And when she says quick, she means quick. So this has changed significantly from last year. We were not only blessed with donations in a large amount from individuals, but we had foundation funds from $200 up to $15,000. So we definitely appreciate all the support that everyone gives to us. And if you have questions on how that is spent or divided up or anything, you can send me a chat here or go to the website and send me an email, and I would be happy to share.
All right, thanks so much, Claire and Rochelle. I didn't give them a shout out earlier, so I do just want to say that the work we do at CNVS would very literally be impossible without Claire and Rochelle, so thank you both. And before closing out the business portion of the evening, I would like to thank all of you for your support of CNVS. This war has shown how important it is to develop an infrastructure for peace. We're trying to do our small part of that. Your donations make that possible. And if you're curious about other kinds of support, we are also looking for new board members. Our board is small but mighty. We'd like it to be a bit bigger and mighty. So if you're interested in helping out in that way, please feel free to get in touch with us. We'd love to have your help.
Thank you, Sean. And I forgot to tell you, everyone, I'm the program director at the center. And Rochelle is our valiant administrative assistant. So I'm very pleased to have Mr. Ed Aguilar speaking with us tonight, coming in all the way from Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. One thing that's really important in the peace building field is that we connect with each other, that we make each other's work known. And I had an opportunity through Mass Peace Action conference that was planned earlier in the year to hear Ed speak about his campaign, No Wars, No Warming. And I thought, what a great thing to bring to our own city. But he comes from the Coalition for Peace Action in Pennsylvania, and they are doing terrific work. And we are glad to uphold their work tonight and to make you aware of it. It is part of this infrastructure for peace building that we need to develop, especially in a time of war, and that already exists in our country. So I pass it to Sean to give you more details about Mr. Aguilar. And welcome, Ed. We're so glad for you to join us. And another thank you to all the donors this year. Boy, we take each contribution to heart and we'll try to use your money well. So thank you, everybody.
All right, so Ed Aguilar is a lawyer, a graduate of Temple University, the Beasley School of Law. He worked from 1978 on civil rights and prison reform as a lawyer, and then as Pennsylvania Court Special Master. He was also an adjunct professor of law, teaching international law at St. Joseph's University. His activism for peace goes back to the Vietnam War. From 1986 to 2006, Mr. Aguilar served as president of the Lawyers Alliance for World Security in Pennsylvania, which was led in Washington, D.C. by former U.S. Disarmament Ambassador Tom Graham Jr. In that capacity, he assisted in writing the first drafts of the Nuclear Weapons Convention, now known as the Nuclear Ban Treaty. In 2012, Mr. Aguilar was appointed Pennsylvania Director of the Coalition for Peace Action. In 2015, he co-founded the No Wars, No Warming campaign at CFPA, which he currently chairs. Welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you very much. Am I muted? Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'm going to jump right into my presentation, which is not about climate change, although the war in Ukraine could very well have a tremendous effect. Unfortunately, it's already having a tremendous effect on the environment in Ukraine, of course, about the human environment and the ecological environment. But I'm going to speak today more directly about the war. 1 second, let me just fix something here. Okay. So if I think Rochelle has the PowerPoint materials there. And so let me start with that. I just have to catch up to my to my text here. So the Coalition for Peace Action has worked on solutions to end the threat of nuclear weapons all the way back to 1981, when Ronald Reagan was president. At that time, the world feared US Pershing missiles in Europe, a threat of a first nuclear strike. Today, we face this threat. There's a Russian army occupying parts of Ukraine and invading the rest with brutal force. And the leader of ICAN, that's the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, is a man named Dan Hoekstra. Dan stated, quote, Russia has said they've put nuclear weapons on, quote, special combat readiness or high alert. It is clear, he added, that nuclear weapons do not deter conflict. And we agree. Rather, they add greatly to the risks. And in this case, whether by design or by miscalculation, they could lead to tremendous escalation and even a nuclear war in Europe. By the way, I've worked with nuclearban.us and Timon and Vicky and all the people there in your area who are wonderful on this issue. In any case, there is now, for the first time in many years, I believe, a real threat of a nuclear war in Europe. For example, for the first time since 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, two nuclear powers could actually be involved in a direct conflict situation if we're not very careful. Now, so far, President Biden has wisely rejected a so-called no-fly zone, that is, where you might be in combat versus Russian aircraft. But what happens if things deteriorate further? For example, just yesterday, March 21, President Putin's assistant, Dmitry Peskov, threatened to break diplomatic relations with the United States, which would cut off most communications, let alone the serious negotiations. That is what we really need. We believe this war must end. Russia must withdraw its troops, missiles, and attack aircraft back to its own territory. The war is a blatant violation of the Geneva Conventions on Crimes Against Humanity. It appears that serious war crimes have in fact been committed against civilians. We're here today to talk about both the horrors of war, preventing further escalation, and some long-term solutions. None of this will be easy, but all of it is essential to restore a world at peace in Europe and beyond. So let's go, Rochelle, please, to slide 2. So recently, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres and Pope Francis both joined in calling for an end to the war, for an end to the Russian intervention, and a ceasefire, as well as serious negotiations to end the conflict. Meanwhile, so far, Russia has made little progress in its attempt to conquer Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, and other major cities. So it has instead doubled down on attacks on the civilian populations of many cities and towns. Ukraine has indeed filed a claim in the International Court of Justice at The Hague, or ICJ, on Russia's pretext for invading. And that pretext was, if you can believe it, Russia was claiming that Ukraine was committing genocide on Russian speakers in Ukraine, especially in the Donbass, the eastern provinces. No proof has ever been shown of anything of that sort. However, meantime, this ICJ is the civil court and the International Criminal Court. They both have, or ICC, both have jurisdiction over violations of the Geneva Conventions and other international norms in an armed conflict. And the West, led by the US, the EU, and NATO, have imposed stringent sanctions, which Mr. Putin has called economic warfare. They are, in fact, providing weapons, defensive weapons, and economic and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. But so far, the Biden administration has opposed the no-fly zone, while on the other hand, President Zelensky of Ukraine has called on the West to close the sky. The skies, another name for a no-fly zone. I believe this would be a very risky proposition. He has added that he has vowed to never surrender to Russian occupation of Ukraine by force of arms. That, of course, I think we can agree with. This week, Russia called for surrender of the Black Sea port city of Mariupol, which sadly we've all been watching on the nightly news, being bombed brutally. Mariupol alone, a city of 400,000, has lost an estimated 2,400 civilians by now to bombing from the air and even from ships at sea, Russian naval vessels in the Black Sea. Ukraine has refused to surrender the city. Now let's go please to the next slide, the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban, there it is. So this crisis compares to today, unfortunately, in several ways. They both involve a US-Russian confrontation capable of leading to a nuclear war. During the 1962 Cuban, it's called the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's really the Russian-American Missile Crisis. The situation was remarkably similar to today's Eastern Europe, although the great powers' roles were reversed, as Dr. Lawrence Whitner, who is a board chair of Peace Action, National Peace Action, and a professor of history and law at NYU. Larry Whitner says, quote, in 1962, the Soviet Union encroached on the US sphere of influence by installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, only 90 miles from the US. The Cubans had requested these as deterrent to a US invasion. The Soviets wanted to reassure their new Cuban ally of protection and felt missile deployments would even the nuclear balance, as the US had deployed nuclear missiles in Turkey on Russia's border, unquote, from Professor Whitner. President Kennedy ordered a naval quarantine of Cuba, but he rejected the advice of most of his generals to take direct military action. Let me repeat that. Most of his generals decided or offered the advice that we should take direct military action against Khrushchev. With Russian troops in Cuba, it could have meant World War III. Instead, Kennedy made an agreement with Premier Khrushchev. The USSR removed the missiles from Cuba. Kennedy pledged not to invade Cuba and removed US missiles from Turkey. They recognized that their two nuclear armed nations had arrived at an incredibly dangerous impasse and were sliding toward nuclear war. As a result, they de-escalated the situation. Quote, de-escalation could be worked out in connection with today's conflict. For example, as many countries of the region have joined NATO or are applying to do so, thanks to fear that Russia will resume its domination of their nations, the Russian government could instead provide them with appropriate security guarantees by rejoining the Conventional Forces Treaty in Europe, which Russia withdrew from a decade ago. Or we could revisit the proposals for European common security, a mutual security agreement popularized in the 1980s by President Mikhail Gorbachev, the Russian reformer. At the very least, Russia should withdraw its massive armada, clearly designed for intimidation or invasion, from Ukraine's border. Again, that's Dr. Whitner. Now, these possibilities imply the goodwill, enough goodwill to talk seriously. There have been negotiations, so-called, for about at least a week between Russia and Ukraine, but those talks have really not gone very far. But we have to make serious talks happen. We too can learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dr. Whitner, as I mentioned, is professor of history emeritus at SUNY, and I will put on the chat a bit later on a link to that. Can we go to the next slide? There are always options for mediation in a war of choice such as this one. In 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt of the United States mediated an end to the war between Russia and Japan over Sakhalin Island and other islands in the Pacific. In fact, for his successful efforts, President Roosevelt was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. Mediation usually works when there is a military or political stalemate, and both sides realize that they're better off mediating a solution rather than fighting a long and destructive struggle that will decimate their troops, their national morale, their territory, and civilians. And in the case of Russia, the reputation on the world stage. Let's go to the next slide, the International Court of Justice. So in 1996, the International Court of Justice, in a case brought by nations supported by NGOs, so your chair mentioned that I'd been involved in this situation, and that's true. Together with Ambassador Graham and many others, we wrote a draft of a nuclear weapons convention and took the issue to the World Court. In 1996, the International Court of Justice stated as follows: it follows from the above mentioned requirements that the threat of use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules of international law applicable in armed conflict, and in particular, the principles and rules of humanitarian law. However, in view of the current state of international law, the court cannot conclude definitively whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of a state would be at stake, in which the very survival of the state, in other words, the state launching nuclear weapons, would be at stake. But today, the survival of Russia is not at stake. Russia is, in fact, the initiator of this war, not the attacked party. It's a clear violation of international law. After Ukraine sued in the International Court of Justice to hold Russia culpable in the invasion, the court heard the case and quickly issued a brief but scalding order. While provisional, the order basically said that Russia's invasion was without foundation in international law or norms. However, Russia refused to even enter its appearance. In other words, they did not show up at The Hague at the International Court of Justice. The next step, some say, is to go to the International Criminal Court, which deals with crimes against peace, crimes against the international order, and crimes against humanity. Now let's go to the next slide, Marina Aliluyeva. Here is a now famous photo of Marina Aliluyeva, a producer at Channel one of the largest television networks in Russia. She's not the person at the desk. She's the person holding the sign behind the news reader. The sign says no to war in English and Russian, and continues in Russia: do not let yourself be propagandized. This war is based on lies. End the war now. Her message was intrinsically for the Russian people, many of whom, because the only news they get is through state television, have believed their president, Putin, that this war is somehow justified. Marina Aliluyeva has since been brought to court. She's been fined about 30,000 rubles, which sounds like more than it is because the ruble is now worth 1 cent. It's about $300. And she may face further retribution, even jail time. But many Russians quietly agree with Marina. According to the New York Times of March 20th, more Russians have left the country, including artists, scholars, professionals, even sports figures, than at any time since the 1990s. Some hope to return when this war is over, but many say they're gone for good. Here is a short quote from Alexei Kovalev, editor of Meduza.com, a large, formerly Moscow news outlet, on March 4th of this year, a week into the war. Dateline Moscow, shock and shame. That's the response of many Russians to the sight of rocket and artillery shells hitting Ukrainian apartment tower blocks that could easily be in Moscow. The towns through which Russian armored vehicles are rolling, accompanied by howls of horror, could be easily Voronezh or Krasnodar or any Russian city. And it's being done in our name. Whatever military victory Mr. Putin might find acceptable in his twisted mind, those are Mr. Kovalev's words, Russia has already suffered a crushing moral defeat, close quote. So since the beginning of the war, from St. Petersburg in the west to Vladivostok in the far east, in 113 cities, demonstrations of protest have occurred. In fact, at least 15,500 Russian citizens have now been arrested for violating a new law, new rules against freedom of assembly, where any gathering of two or more about the war is considered illegal, and the new so-called misinformation law, risking 15 years in jail for stating opposition to the war or facts about the war, which contradict the official media. Since this was written, Alexei Kovalev is now exiled to Latvia, where, however, he's still publishing his dissenting opinions from across the border. The majority of Russians, though, as I've said, get news only from state media and have accepted Putin's story that the war is about cleansing Ukraine of, quote, Nazis, unquote, and also gnats and insects. So that's the situation within Russia today. It harkens back either back to the Stalinist days of the Soviet Union, or perhaps even back to an earlier time of Tsarist Russia. Can we go to the next slide? So this slide, oh wait, I'm sorry. Oh, here it is. Okay, sorry. These got switched around a little bit. So National Public Radio has reported that 3 Russian cosmonauts ordered the International Space Station wearing yellow and blue. In an apparent statement of support for Ukraine, wearing the colors of the Ukrainian flag has widely been seen as a way to oppose the Russian invasion. The 3 cosmonauts, Oleg Artemyev, Denis Matveyev, and Sergei Korsakov, docked their Soyuz MS-21 spacecraft on Friday. The mission is planned for 6 months. Now, kind of tongue-in-cheek, when asked about this, Oleg Artemyev, who's the former commander of the space station, said, "Oh, we just had a lot of yellow and blue material, and we thought we would use it." But meantime, more seriously, a joint European-Russian mission to Mars has already been delayed because of the war and because of sanctions. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So here's a tale of 2 cities. I don't know why this is on here. Okay, so you see on the left is Lviv, a city the size of Philadelphia, which is mostly intact. It's in the Western Ukraine, an area that Russia has not yet penetrated, except by the occasional missile attack. On the right is Mariupol, let me go back here. And Mariupol, of course, is the city that has faced the full wrath of the Russian air, land, and sea attack. As I may have mentioned already, 2,400 people have already died in Mariupol. Many of the rest would have liked to go west. Some of them have actually been, according to news reports, have actually been forced to across the border to Russia. And some of these reports are confirmed, some are not. But the report is that it includes over 2,000 children on the theory that they are Russian speaking and should be in Russia. Let's go on to the next slide. So the $1 trillion question is, how do we really end this war? I have some recent news on this, on some of these possibilities. Just the other day, we were privileged to have at our annual membership meeting for Coalition for Peace Action, Reverend Bob Moore invited Ambassador Thomas Pickering, a senior diplomat with much experience in Europe and Russia. Here's what we learned in a nutshell. One, the US and its allies, said Ambassador Pickering, should not escalate, including with a no-fly zone. And I don't think any of us disagreed with them. However, Ukraine needs to be able to conduct self-defense. So she should not be deprived of the defensive weapons being provided. President Biden, he said, is, quote, walking a fine line, unquote, and we can't provoke Putin to escalate his nuclear threats, which might then mean World War III, the ultimate unthinkable outcome. Pickering said that Ukraine may well be a bridge country whose economy would be linked to the European Union in the future, but also in certain ways, it might be linked to the Eurasian Economic Union, which includes Russia and some Eastern European and Asian states. That seems unlikely to me, for any time soon. However, we did agree to another comment where he said that neutrality might be an option. I'd be happy to discuss that more in the Q&A. Another point the ambassador made was we could return to limiting conventional forces in Europe between East and West without putting these borders in great danger. It is possible to have an arms control basis of that limit on conventional arms. Third, he said, there was a treaty on missiles, as you know, which the US said was not viable. These were intermediate range missiles. Ambassador Pickering said perhaps missile limits should be restored on that front. On China, the US would want to preserve its missiles in Asia as long as China retains its short and long range nuclear weapons. We need a series of this fourth and final point, a series of conferences. One, let Ukraine continue dealing with Russia on Ukrainian security issues. But he suggested a series of conferences once this is done, including a broader international security conference that might agree to return to disarmament rather than more confrontation. This is a hopeful view, with which we at the Coalition for Peace Action largely agreed. Countries could guarantee this to prevent, and in case Ukraine, pardon me, in case Ukraine is attacked. In the past, the US and Russia had built downs of nukes, all of which could resume if we can bring this nightmare to an end. So can we go to the, I guess that's the last slide. Okay. What will come next for Europe, Ukraine, and Central Europe? Well, this is a very tough question. We see there the young person wrapped in a blanket at a train station. I believe this is in Warsaw, Poland, one of almost 4 million displaced persons. We won't necessarily call them refugees because some will want to return to Ukraine once this is over. But she is one of just millions of people, 2 million in Poland alone. And I think the greatest thing that the US could do right now, instead of doubling down on sending more weapons, instead we should double and triple down and increase the budget. And I hope we'll all talk to Congress about it, for humanitarian assistance and for reform of our visa laws and regulations, so that it will be easier for refugees, not only from Ukraine, but from Afghanistan, Yemen, and other places that are in serious trouble, to be able to have a chance. So that's basically my presentation, and I will be happy to here we go. Oh, there is one more. And of course, that is, how do we prevent? One second. How do we prevent future wars? And that's pretty clear. We need now more than ever, we need disarmament. We need to restore the INF Treaty. We need to build down nuclear weapons rather than multiply the number of nuclear weapons. So far, the US and Russia were going to extend the New START Treaty. They agreed to do it, but they haven't actually signed on the dotted line. We should talk to our senators, talk to our congresspeople. This definitely has to happen. And finally, we need the nuclear ban treaty, technically called the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Already the law of the land as part of international law, because enough countries have ratified for that to be the case. It's been signed by 122 countries at a conference, and I was thrilled and privileged to attend that conference in 2017. 122 countries have signed. None of the major nuclear powers have signed. They all need to do it, and we all need to reestablish peace in the world. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to discuss with you.
Thank you very much, Ed, for that overview. You gave us a lot to talk about, the different elements of this war, the dangers of nuclear weapons, what the prospects of mediation are at the high level, some examples of Russian resistance, and some examples of what could be done going forward. This time is open for taking questions or offering reflections on the current crisis. I have a couple of updates and from Europe to share, certainly with the audience, but are there, I cannot see all of the screen, so
Yeah, I'm trying to get rid of that.
yes, if you have a question, just unmute yourself and let's hope that we won't overlap.
Is that
Or if
better?
you have a reaction to Ed's talk. Just going to look on page 2. While we're waiting for people's brains to get going here, I have one. Ed, you maybe explain for us what the START treaty is exactly.
Okay, so we have the START Treaty and the New START Treaty. The most recent one is the New START Treaty, which is a treaty between Russia and the United States. So that's a bilateral treaty, not, many disarmament treaties are global or multilateral. This one is only between the top 2 nuclear weapon states, Russia and the US. And what New START, which was negotiated by Barack Obama with President Medvedev, there was one term in which President Putin decided to take a pause from the presidency. And one of his top assistants was elected president, Dmitry Medvedev, and he and Obama actually signed the New START Treaty in, I believe, 2010. And that treaty reduced the total number of nuclear weapons on each side to 5,500, and the number of deployed weapons, in other words, those that are usable and operational, to 1,550. So that's the current number, 1,550. And so but before this war started in Ukraine, so Biden, and as soon as President Biden came into office on January 20th, I believe the first or second thing he did was to sign off on extending that treaty. That treaty can be extended every 5 years. So he signed off, and for that matter, so did President Putin. And so technically that treaty should be extended unless some people say that Congress should have a voice and stop that. But I disagree. I don't believe that under international law they have the right to, usually the Senate, as you know, in a treaty case, has the right to advise and consent. But this is not a treaty, it's an executive agreement. And therefore, both presidents were able to extend it.
So we're having some reflections here from in the chat box that I'm looking that are challenging. I think the more look. How can I summarize these questions correctly? The security is the key detail here for both parties, right? Ukraine and Russia. Russia worried about NATO expansion, and Ukraine obviously facing a security threat with the Russian invasion. But there's certainly been a lot of writing from American writers about that NATO expansion really being the larger context for this conflict, and in fact is really between, I don't want to say game because that's too trite, a geopolitical power play, deadly power play between the US and Russia, because even prior to the Russian invasion, there was concern about return to the Cold War. Then, in fact, a new version of the Cold War happening, and that NATO was probably not going to let Ukraine in anyway. And so was the country sort of this larger, framework of the security of NATO kind of driving this conflict, and NATO with US behind it. I hope I'm summarizing this correctly. And Ellen, if I didn't treat your question fairly,
The censorship is so horrific
Well,
that it's just unbelievable. Thank you for letting me say 2 seconds here. The censorship is so horrific that I don't think we've ever seen anything quite to this extent, where you're getting a one-track media presentation. And this is why they banned so many left-wing and progressive and any kind of Russian media. That a number of our own speakers have been on the RT, for example, Russia, but there are many that are just no longer available. So if you look carefully, you can find them. So that's why I made a list of Chris Hedges and the New Cold War. They're giving basically what you just said. I think you put it very, very well, that it's very complicated. And that's why I put the documentary in there, the old Ukrainian leaders. This is not a pro-Ukraine documentary, but it's also not I don't think it's at all a pro-Russian documentary. And I really recommend it. You will not find that level of Central European history that we all need to know. The coups and the evolution of the various leaders and their relationship with Russia, and how this was such an enormous buildup after the Cold War, where we had a chance to get rid of this Russia-phobia that the world now is engulfed in. And I think it's the greatest pressure towards that doomsday that we all fear, towards letting nuclear determine. I mean, the most recent discovery of the 30 or so biolabs that the US operates in Ukraine was pretty eye-opening. But yes, I agree with our speaker, Ed, that we have to also put time and effort into the refugees and into humanitarian aid. But I am just amazed at how little we get on negotiations. And and I don't think it's, I let Ed talk about this, but I do not think it's primarily the Russians from everything I get, because I go to CGTN, which I didn't put there, which is the Chinese station. And they're very competent to bring in top policymakers who sound objective. They're not waving the yellow, they're not waving the Russian flag by any means, but they're worth listening to. If people want to stay involved in this, maybe it doesn't make any sense to stay so involved.
You want me to comment on that?
Oh yeah, of course. I'm just.
So
yeah.
there's a couple of things. First of all, yes, propaganda is the right word. And there is Russian propaganda. There's propaganda, if we are truthful, is propaganda from every state. And the US is not free of it, although we do have a much freer press. The reason we can cite Chris Hedges, and I read an excellent article on Counterpunch the other day that was very much, had a different point of view. We still have a free press in this country. And so, yeah, we are privileged to have the kind of discussion we're having. No one's going to censor us for any disagreements we may have with each other or with, the Biden government or anything else of that sort. That's not to excuse anything, but there is propaganda on every side. You have to use your judgment. You have to use, your smarts. You have to use your knowledge of history. It's a complicated situation, let me just say a couple things. One is people have talked about Finland as a model. That's a possibility. Finland is a country that you may know was actually invaded by Stalin during World War II. And it was an independent country, but it was invaded, and Stalin held on to the eastern half of Finland, which was called Karelia. But Finland remained independent, and in order to avoid, after World War II, in order to avoid further conflict with Russia, became neutral. And this was accepted by the West and was accepted by Russia. Ukraine is a country that historically has been, now I'm going to be very careful in how I say this, okay? It has historically been part of the domain, okay, of Russia. I'm talking about Imperial Russia. The Tsars conquered Ukraine several hundred years ago. It remained as a colony of Russia, not an equal state within Russia, but a colony of Russia, okay? And it was not until the end of the Soviet Union that Ukraine regained its independence in 1994. Now, in 1994, there were guarantees not only for Russia, but for Ukraine that were supposed to, maintain security. And there were the Belgrade agreements, there were the Minsk agreements. I mean, we could spend an hour just describing what these agreements is, but the bottom line was Ukraine was guaranteed its security as a sovereign nation for the first time in hundreds of years. And the Ukrainians have cherished that. Now, Vladimir Putin has a different point of view. His point of view is, we have Mother Russia, sometimes known in history as Great Russia. We have White Russia, which is known as Belarus. And we have, and this is a historical term, we have Little Russia, okay? Little Russia is what the Russians called Ukraine. And in fact, they brought in many Russian speakers into the eastern part of Ukraine. And that's why we now have these separatist provinces in the Donbass, Luhansk, and I'm forgetting the other one. So it is a complicated situation. But in terms of my view, I taught international law for many years. In my view of international law, if a country is independent, and it should be guaranteed its sovereignty. Ukraine actually gave up nuclear weapons. What happened when the Soviet Union was dissolved itself, frankly, under Yeltsin, is that Soviet weapons were left behind, including nuclear weapons. There were 3,000 nuclear weapons. I was with an organization called LAWS, Lawyers Alliance for World Security, that I think Claire mentioned in the introduction. And so we had people in that organization, a man named George Bunn, former ambassador George Bunn, who worked on that agreement to make sure that Ukraine remained sovereign, independent, and free. And in exchange, Ukraine voluntarily gave up those nuclear weapons. And you don't want to have other states like Iran or others think, oh no, I can't give up the thought of nuclear weapons because I'm going to be attacked. But that's exactly what's happened to Ukraine. So there's many perspectives, but I think the correct international law perspective is this was an illegal invasion. Yes, Russia had grievances. They could have negotiated them with the EU and the US and NATO. Instead, it chose to invade Ukraine with horrible results.
So We have a question here from Peter, or observation that echoes what you stated, that one interpretation of this conflict is that Ukraine gave up nuclear arms and made itself susceptible to, is consequently susceptible to an invasion that occurred. I just want to interject a different framework because I think our old systems are clearly not working for humanity. And the old system is that nuclear weapons are the currency of power and currency of security. So if you've got them, you can better be damn sure nobody's going to come after you because you got them. And that in effect is not working because the rest of the world is cowering under their kitchen tables, hoping that a regional conflict doesn't become planetary, and in fact is very destabilizing. So when we ask ourselves, what is security? I think the global majority would say, this is not security for us, meaning a nuclear arrangement where a few people, groups, countries, nation states have the big guns. There is another framework that is put forth, and that is the framework of common security, which is based on the premise that you are as secure as your enemy is. And it understands the mutuality between security. So yes, you don't have a right to be invaded, but if the neighbor feels that the circumstances are destabilizing, that destabilizing phenomenon has to be addressed. That's part of your security component. And this, unfortunately, that framework, which was being explored in Europe and is much more autonomous, it's much more local, it's much more the people on the ground decide what it is, has certainly been overshadowed by this invasion. And I think we're at a crossroads as a species. Are we going to conclude from this catastrophic war that nuclear weapons are the thing, so get yours and hang on to them? Or are we going to conclude that this was such a risk for so many people that we must exert 100% effort towards global disarmament, which the nuclear ban treaty provides the vehicle for that? What does that entail? You know,
That should
making
be-
illegal. So I think
That
we're
should be
really
the model.
at that crossroad. And as peace builders, I hope we're all drawing the second conclusion, because a security based on nuclear arsenals is extremely unstable, extremely. And you know, that's what we are seeing here. It should be noted that in the new Cuban Missile Crisis, which you cited, Ed, paradoxically, it elicited a kind of expansion of the arsenals on both the US and Soviet side, but it also elicited a bevy of disarmament negotiations. And Kennedy unilaterally, I think, pursued it, you know, eliminated above ground testing. So I think realistically that might be the way we go, but I certainly hope that we'll, as a species, go for a world without these weapons, because it's.
And there's another
Sorry, go ahead.
aspect to that too, which is all the money that we're spending on nuclear weapons and on militarizing our society. I mean, we now have local police forces with military weapons. They actually have not quite tanks, but armored vehicles you can see in any major city. Whenever there's some kind of SWAT team situation. And it extends, of course, beyond that. The Pentagon budget is at record levels. This has happened both under Republican and Democratic administrations. We have what seems to be a new Cold War going on. Now, I want to mention China for a moment because I think China is in an interesting position. You may have noticed that China has never built anywhere say, on the similar scale of nuclear weapons as Russia or the United States. China's nuclear weapons number in the hundreds. It's estimated between 200 and 300 nuclear weapons. And why is that? Because China knows that nuclear weapons are very, very expensive. They don't really deter war. You know, there have been many wars around the world during the whole nuclear era. So the idea that nuclear weapons deter wars is just not correct historically and legally. So yeah, this nuclear regime, and finally, the other thing is we're now faced with pandemics, not one, you know. This pandemic has had at least 3 or 4 stages. It could have another one. So we're faced with other threats that really should unite us. And I really agree with what you said, Claire, about common security, because things like climate change, you know, 5 years ago, I helped to co-found the No Wars, No Warming campaign, which the whole thesis is we have to turn from weapons to uniting, to fighting the existential crisis, because it is the other existential crisis facing humanity, which is climate change. And the longer we wait while we're playing, you know, these nuclear games, the worse it's going to get.
So I just want to check if there are others who have questions, and I also want to highlight some, because we are talking about nonviolent solutions here at the centers. I want to highlight some examples of really fresh thinking on these problems and nonviolent solutions. The first is that there is a Europeans for Peace issued a statement yesterday declaring that if there was not a ceasefire on March 24th, which marks the 1-month anniversary of this war, that there would be caravans of nonviolent activists going into Ukraine to sort of be a populist demand for the ceasefire. Whether that comes about, we will see, but people can certainly look at the reflections and thinking of Europeans for Peace, which is a humanist organization that began in 2006, and they have been writing and speaking out about this war, and especially about NATO expansion and no further militarization of Europe as a result of this war. The other resource is in the faith communities. For the Catholic tradition, the Archbishop Wester, at the beginning of this year, literally a month before this war started, wrote a very elaborate pastoral, a sort of teaching document calling for nuclear abolition. So no longer finding any moral justification from the language of the Christianity and Christian texts for nuclear deterrence. I mean, honestly, light dawns on Marblehead. But what is interesting about the pastoral is that he includes the final chapter of how he's speaking out of the Archdiocese of New Mexico, which is where the Los Alamos lab and nuclear production, it's one of the epicenters of US nuclear arms production. So he gives very concrete nonviolent solutions in chapter 4 on using the intellectual power that's represented in Los Alamos to demobilize our existing arsenal and how that can switch. So that's another very important resource. The International Peace Bureau is convening Russian Voices for Peace, Ukrainian pacifists, along with Europeans. And they, thanks to Zoom, are meeting regularly to address how to respond to this war and how to respond to its after effects, because we know that, even after a ceasefire, there's a lot of restoration that has to happen, not just of bodies, but also of education and imagination. So that is the third resource that we want to highlight. And then the fourth is that the Meta Center for Nonviolence in California is posting regularly examples of Russian resistance to this war, some very creative efforts that are still happening despite the crackdown by the Putin administration, by the Kremlin. So those, we're sharing a lot of those resources on our Facebook page, and we will also, we shared that the Kroc Institute today hosted a whole panel on civilian resistance and what are the examples happening in Ukraine, because we don't, stingers are not the only option for confronting tanks. There's the whole history of unarmed human beings confronting tanks. And so there was a very rigorous panel presentation today. So I just want to make our audience aware of that.
Let me add one. I think those are all excellent efforts. And I've worked with the International Peace Bureau, and you may know Abolition 2000, which is a broad international network of hundreds of organizations. And recently, we put out a statement that was endorsed by over 100 Nobel winners, not all Peace Prize winners, but some of them scientists, some of them peace advocates, some of them chemistry and physiology. Anyway, the statement basically says that in August, when we have the, every 5 years, there's the so-called NPT review conference. So very quickly, that's the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is supposed to be when we all agreed that nuclear weapons would go down to zero. Okay, I'm oversimplifying, but in 1970, all of the nuclear armed powers, as well as the non-nuclear weapon states, as they're called, agreed. And in Article 6 of that treaty, they agreed that there should be good faith negotiations to bring the nuclear weapons regime that you and I have been talking about to an end by negotiation. So, this is not a new effort, but it's a very important effort. And that has been endorsed by many nations at the United Nations as well. So I'm hopeful that when the NPT reconvenes for the review conference in August, that we can have some good developments there. And, there are also people within the nuclear weapon states who come to these review conferences because either they're NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or, for example, you have Scotland. Scotland is a part of the United Kingdom, which is a nuclear power, but the Scottish Parliament has a certain amount of autonomy, and they have argued that Scotland should not permit even British nuclear weapons on its soil. So there's some very interesting developments. There are large anti-nuclear movements. They're kind of quiescent in terms of publicity because so much else is going on these days. But there are large anti-nuclear movements in Europe, and as you mentioned, the European peace group there. I'm actually hopeful that people begin to see, we really need to change.
And just to add that in July, there will be a meeting to look at the UN Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So their 1-year review would have happened this winter, but because of COVID, they couldn't do it. So now there will be a 1.5-year review for that treaty, which is called for total prohibition. And as Ed pointed out, the value of the UN ban treaty is that it makes illegal the possession, distribution, and production. So that is what the Scottish Parliament is potentially standing on when they say, we don't want to be a thoroughfare for nuclear weapons. They have, I think I'm explaining that correctly, I hope. But I'm mindful of the time. Sorry, go ahead. So are there any other questions? We have some wonderful back and forth here in the chat, which we'll save. And when we send the recording, we'll also give some of these resources that were listed. So if anyone has one final question, otherwise we'll thank you so much for being with us, Ed. Well, thank you everybody for joining us and being with us this evening. I hope next year we can do this in person. It will be wonderful to get in the room together, but we so appreciate everyone making the time on a weeknight to join us. Stay tuned. We will be having a presenter in April, and more events coming, and look for our walking tour of Worcester's peace history.
Can I say thank you for inviting me? I really enjoyed it. You have an excellent group here. And when you get the recording of this conference, I'll be happy to share it with the Coalition for Peace Action. We have 5,000 members in Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And I think it would be a useful thing for some of our members to see. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Thanks. And all our best to the peacemakers in Philadelphia.
Namaste.
Okay.